Hello, everyone, and welcome to another ASUG Partner Webcast. My name is Maureen McInerney, Partner Marketing Specialist here at ASUG, and I'll be your moderator for this event. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for this presentation. Today's webcast is being recorded. The link to the recording and the accompanying slides will be posted to the ASUG website, and all registrants will receive an email with a link to those materials. I'd like to remind our audience members that you can submit your questions at any time by clicking the purple Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Today's webcast is your SuccessFactors and SAP HCM environment ready for GDPR. Our speakers today are Tobias Bloch and Ari Levin from Accenture Software for Human Capital Management. And now I'd like to hand it over to Tobias.
Hello, thank you, Maureen, and I would like to welcome everybody to the webinar. My name is Tobias Bloch. I'm VP of Sales for Accenture Software for HCM. So today we're going to be talking about GDPR. And just before we get going, I have a legal disclaimer that I'm forced to read out, so let me just do that. So the opinions and recommendations in this document and this webinar should not be construed as legal advice. Accenture Software for Human Capital Management recommends that entities and companies subject to legislation seek legal counsel and from qualified sources. And the main reason we're saying that is GDPR is quite complex, right? What you're going to hear today is around some very, very specific tools that our department has to help with mitigating some of the legislation and becoming compliant with GDPR. But they're not a silver bullet, right? So again, talk to your internal counsel, talk to your auditors, make sure you fully understand what GDPR says, and then find ways to match through systems and processes and tools, ways to become compliant. So let me go off to slide 4 and give you a little bit of background on what is Accenture Software for Human Capital Management. So I think most people know Accenture is a very large and long-standing consulting company, and that is absolutely true. It's over 400,000 consultants that work for Accenture. Now, the software division is a very, very small entity within that, and what we do, our specific business unit, we're laser focused on building extensions and productivity software for HR and payroll and talent management, specifically around SuccessFactors and SAP HR and payroll on-prem. We've been doing it for close to 20 years, and today we're glad to say that we've got close to 2,000 customers who run the applications you're going to be hearing about, either in their SAP HR payroll on-premise solution or within their SuccessFactors Employee Central solution, and sometimes in both when they have a hybrid model. So you're going to be hearing about 3 specific tools. Let's just jump right into what is GDPR. And again, I am not an expert, but the easiest way I would say to explain GDPR is it's a set of regulations around protecting personal and private information. And what it applies to is if you've got in your system data from either employees or customers, and those employees or customers are citizens of the European Union, then you need to oblige with GDPR. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're headquartered in Chicago or San Francisco or Toronto or Frankfurt. The point is, it doesn't matter where the system is. It matters whether or not you are in control of data that belongs to a European citizen. So that is the catch that we're finding more and more of our customers, especially the ones which are headquartered in North America, is that they may have very, very large operations in North America, and that's what their critical mass is, but they've got small operations in Europe, small number of employees, and they are dragged into the GDPR regulations by that fact. So with that, we don't want to scare you. We've got lots of things that can help you out. And with that, I'm going to hand over directly to Ari Levin, who's going to drill down and show you how these 3 products that we've talking about, how it's going to help you with GDPR compliance, both in your SuccessFactors system, as well as your traditional HR payroll on-premise system. So with that, Ari, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tobias. And just by way of a quick introduction, folks, I'm sitting outside of Toronto today, and I am a global solutions architect for Accenture Software for HCM with a little over a decade experience in SAP HCM and a little bit less in SuccessFactors, but somewhere in the same range. Okay, so we're talking about GDPR today, and just again to echo what Tobias says, or said earlier, I'm going to try to do some education now, and then we'll jump into kind of some of the points that I think are specifically addressable to, let's say, our HR systems, and how we use them, and how we store data in them, and how we process data with them. Okay, but in general, what we're doing is we are addressing now, let's say, some concerns and some solutions and some fixes that can help us to become GDPR compliant, which means that we are following the regulations that have been set aside in the EU, which are coming into effect in May, which many companies globally are now dealing with. So the question becomes, why bother in the first place? So obviously, now there are, let's say, huge penalties that can arise because of data breaches and a lack of proper process around handling of data. And we don't want any of that to affect us as global organizations, and so we'll act accordingly. And I guess another good question is, why bother talking about this in North America? And you can see on the screen here that there's a little bit of checklist here, right? So even though we're North American companies, obviously we have North American legislation to deal with, whether it's HIPAA in the States or PIPEDA in Canada or any of the other kind of more, let's say, local regulations around data processing that we're dealing with here. So all important things to think about, but in general, most companies that are global organizations are going to have some sort of footprint, whether it's actual operations in Europe or employees who are working for them who either are EU citizens or reside in Europe. So you can see some checklists here that's on my screen around, does your company have any customers in Europe, or do you have any contractors who work for you in Europe, or do you process any data for EU citizens? So all these questions, if you answer yes to any of them, would push you towards making sure that you're GDPR compliant, and this is what we're concerned with today. So how is GDPR laid out? Well, obviously, and I suggest wholeheartedly that everybody have a read. It's not too long, believe it or not, but the regulations are laid out in different articles, and you can see on my screen here a bunch of different articles that we're going to, let's say, address in brief today around some of the things that would affect our HR systems, specifically around SuccessFactors and SAP HCM. So things like pseudonymization and the right to be forgotten and how we process personal data and what our responsibilities are. These are all things that we need to think about from the perspective of our HR systems. Okay? So before we jump into some of these specifics, worthwhile mentioning, okay, there's, let's say, 3 different areas that I want to talk about today around software tools that can help with the processing of data that will help us, that will assist us in our GDPR compliance. Okay, so again, I want to just make sure that everybody understands that what we are trying to do here is assist with GDPR compliance. These tools by themselves do not make you GDPR compliant. You need to work with your legal counsel to make sure that you are in compliance with GDPR. Okay, and sorry for saying the word GDPR so often. We'll try to tone it down a little bit. So 3 areas. One is around testing and migration. Okay, so basically how we deal with data in our productive environments, our non-productive environments, and what process changes we might have, going forward. So, and a quick example of this is, in the past you might have had a situation whereby I think pretty much everybody had copied their production to their QA system on a regular basis in order to be able to do debugging, testing, and all the associated activities. Well, in the future, it may not be okay to just do a straight copy from production to QA and keep all of the data. That would be considered live data or employee personal data in your downstream, so non-productive environments, unless you have specific purposes for using that data. So it's not okay to just, or may not be okay to just do full copies anymore. So that's one example there for testing and migration consolidation. Another area we want to look at is specifically around data quality and auditing. So if we think about it, some of the new regulations deal with how we process and how long we store and retain employee data. So for example, if I have a contractor who's working for me, and then 2 years later, let's say, they're no longer working for me, is it okay that I still keep information for them around dependents and national ID information and emergency contact information? And to be in compliance with GDPR, maybe that might not be the case anymore. Maybe we need to make sure that we delete that. And so the question becomes, do we have a good way of auditing our data to ensure that we have compliance in that situation? Okay, and so we'll talk a little bit about data quality auditing. And finally, around the document lifecycle. So one of the areas that GDPR deals with is around this idea of data portability. So an employee has the right to their own data. They have the right to understand what data has been collected of them. They have the right to be forgotten if they want to be forgotten in certain circumstances, obviously. And also, they have the right to take the information that was collected with them when they leave. Okay, so basically data portability. So we'll address some of this through the document lifecycle. Okay, we will leave time for questions, and I want to be able to show you 3 different tools here, so we'll jump into it and see how far we get. Okay, so the first thing, let's talk about some of the articles from GDPR around personal data processing and pseudonymization. Okay, so obviously personal data refers to identifiable data that we can trace back to a specific individual that has some characteristics like specific physical locations, mental, economic, cultural, societal identities, anything that we can kind of attributes of the person that we can identify them with. Okay, and then GDPR also deals with what we call pseudonymization. And my apologies because I always get the pronunciation a little off here. I pronounce pseudonymization. Try saying that 10 times fast. You'll have a tough time. But this is the idea of, I'm going to use the word scrambling, but the idea of making sure that if we're going to store information about a person, that perhaps we can't do that unless we, let's say, remove the link to the actual employee themselves or remove the characteristics around the employee. So this, in practice, would be things like masking data, anonymizing or scrambling data, maybe heavier data encryption. And again, you'll work with your legal counsel to understand the best way to do that, but we'll offer some ideas here. Okay, and specifically, I want to focus in on Articles 4, 5, and 6 that talks around pseudonyms and masking and encryption. To talk to you about one of the tools that we have that helps to deal with this. Okay? So in general, what we're trying to do now is we're trying to ensure that when we deal with, let's say, employee data, either we have the ability to, let's say, scramble it completely so that when we test it or we're testing with it, we don't have any recognizable characteristics with it, or we use it for a specific purpose like testing and then scramble it so that we don't have any recognizable characteristics around the employee afterwards, or effectively we're not dealing with personal data in our QA environments, or that we don't use that data in the first place, so we only copy the very specific pieces that we need to a QA environment to be able to be worked with. So that's a little bit about personal data and pseudonymization and how we'd have to deal with it with respect to GDPR. I'll back up here for 1 second. So I'll just comment, and I actually think I'm going to go down. I'm going to bump down a couple of slides here if you bear with me for 1 moment. Okay, I'll show you this real quick to comment on a bit of a setup for what I'm going to show you here. But we have a tool called Clone and Test. And again, this is a tool that functions with both SuccessFactors in a pure cloud environment or SAP HCM on the ECC stack, or a hybrid scenario that deals with both either individually or at the same time. And what this tool does is allows us to copy master data from one system to another, okay, whether it's from production to QA or QA to a dev system or any other combination you can think of. Okay? And when we copy that data or duplicate the data, let's say, we have the ability to either copy all of it or small pieces of it, whether it's just a single employee or multiple employees, or just parts of the employee record. So I can copy, let's say, an employee's record, but make sure that I don't copy from my production system to my QA system the salary information. Or maybe it's the emergency contact details that I don't need for payroll testing, for example. Okay? And then at the same time, it also allows me to anonymize. So do I want to be able to scramble data in my target system, whether or not that is as I'm actually moving the data from one system to another, or when I get to my target system and I'm working my target system, do I want to be able to scramble after the fact, so do some testing and then scramble. So Clone and Test really allows you to do all of these different things, which specifically addresses the need to be able to pseudonymize within SuccessFactors or SAP according to GDPR. So that's the specific setup here. I want to show you this tool very briefly so you understand how it works and what it could do with respect to being GDPR compliant. So I will share my screen. And you'll have to forgive me because I think there's a couple of seconds delay before you'll see my screen actually pop up. But when you see my screen eventually pop up, you should see that I'm sitting in a SuccessFactors environment. And I'll show you the SuccessFactors flavor of this. But like I said, flavors for both SuccessFactors and SAP, and a combination of the two should you require it, if you're working in a hybrid scenario of some sorts. Okay, so when this pops up, you'll see on my screen, and hopefully it's popped up for everybody by now, you'll see on my screen a SuccessFactors environment with a couple of different widgets which show you, let's say, some of the different SuccessFactors extensions that we develop. And if I click on one of these widgets, I have the ability to jump into any one of them at any given time, which will take me into our SuccessFactors extensions. So now I'm in my SuccessFactors extension for cloning test. You can see in this case I have the ability, very straightforward, to be able to choose a source system, choose an action, whether it's copy, duplicate, anonymize, choose what I want to do from an anonymization perspective, and then ultimately a target. So very, very simple and straightforward, not a difficult tool to be able to use. And what I'll do here is I will actually log into my dev and QA system in this case, so that I can pull some data from my dev and QA system and copy and anonymize it appropriately. We do also support single sign-on if you don't want to have to log in different environments, but a lot of companies we know have the requirement where they have different logins for different environments in this case. So I've logged into my system, and now I want to be able to actually search for an employee that I'm going to, let's say, anonymize or copy and anonymize. And in this case, I have the ability to search by a lot of different factors, whether it's the hierarchy, a specific user, where the location is for all employees, or to take the entire employee structure. So in this case, I'll just do a very quick search, and we'll do a search for Smith and see what pops up. And so I'll return all of the employees who pop up for Smith, and if I'd like to, I can pull all the employees from a direct or indirect report relationship for that specific employee search, or in this case, I'll just have a bunch of single employees pop up, so I don't want to look for reports. So great, I have the employees. I'll choose one for demo purposes here. I'll continue with my selection, and again, hopefully I'm not too far off. But now you can see that I have the ability to do three different things. So one is I can anonymize in place, and so this will let me anonymize the employee, or actually, let's say, make certain aspects of this employee unrecognizable. So again, if we go back to this concept of pseudonymization within GDPR, we have the ability to remove the identifiable attributes around the employee that are considered personal data, right? And you can see here that I can either do it for the entire employee, or I can do it for pieces of the employee. So maybe when I copy, I don't want to copy my national ID information because that's not relevant to my payroll testing. Or maybe I don't want to copy my home address because I don't want to be able to take the home address information down to my QA environment because I'm not testing with the home address per GDPR compliance. So I have the ability to do that. I can also choose to duplicate. So that means basically making a copy of that employee in the existing environment. If I needed more test data, for example, or I can choose to copy, which means to move the employee from one system to another system. So for example, from production to QA. So in this case, I'll just do, let's say, anonymization in place, and I will hit the anonymization button, which now shows me what I'm going to do with respect to being able to scramble. And in general, from a scrambling perspective, if I show you an example here, we have the ability to, for any not quite across the board any field, but for the most part, we have the ability to either delete any field within SuccessFactors. We can fix a value, so everybody, for example, has the same birth date. We can do some randomized values. So for example, let's choose a list of 100 names, and when we go to scramble a person's name, make sure that we take something at random, or a name at random from that list. And then we also have the ability to do what's called, let's say, some rule-based scrambling. So if the person is married, or if they've been employed for over a certain amount of time, then we want to do this specific action to them. So lots of ability to be able to actually scramble to fit that pseudonymization requirement. And then ultimately we choose a target. In this case, because I'm just anonymizing the employee in place. So for example, if I did a mock conversion and then wanted to anonymize all my mock data, I could do that, and I hit start process. And I'm logged out of the system, so I'll have to log back in. I've been sitting there too long. I'll do that real quick. But you'll get the idea. So we have, with Clone and Test for Cloud, we have the ability to, let's say, support that requirement around pseudonymization and protecting personal data. So do we want to take some questions now, or should we keep on moving ahead? We're going to move ahead a little bit, and we'll take some questions towards the end because we have two more topics to get through. So that was great. We saw some stuff around pseudonymization, scrambling, being able to copy employees or parts of an employee record from one system to another so that we only take the pieces that we need from testing perspective. This allows us to basically fulfill some of the regulations from GDPR compliance perspective. So I'll go back to my deck here. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is this whole idea of processing personal data. So this is the idea that we're handling personal data and we're performing some sort of action with it. Okay, and GDPR, and I'll focus on Article 5 here. And again, this is a recurring theme, obviously, but we'll look at some of the specifics around Article 5, deals with how we can process that data. So we need to do things lawfully, obviously, in a transparent manner. We need a limitation. So basically that we're collecting, let's say, data, not just for the sake of collecting it, but so that we're going to use it for a specific purpose. So for example, again, if we go back to this whole idea of processing payroll, when we do our testing in our QA environment, do we need somebody's emergency contact phone number to be able to process data within our payroll system? And I'm not going to give you an answer for that, but what I will say is that if we don't need that, we may need to reconsider our process for being able to take information from our productive environment down our QA environment. The other thing is that I want to focus on now, because we mentioned focusing on data quality and auditing, is if we have information that we don't have a purpose for in our QA environment, or even in our productive environment, or in our downstream environments, that we don't have a specific purpose for, or that we're no longer using, so for example, for terminated employees, can we identify that information appropriately? Do we have the ability to find that information and then to action it accordingly so that we don't come out of compliance? Because it may be that we needed somebody's health and safety records while they were employed with us, but 10 years down the line after they've been terminated, we don't need that information anymore. So we need to be able to remove that information and fulfill an employee's right to be forgotten. Okay, so a couple other things to mention here around data minimization, making sure that we only collect the data that we're dealing with here for a specific purpose. So again, I mentioned in the past that we would just do straight copies from prod to QA. Do we still need to do that, or do we need to just take subsets of our data for testing purposes? And then another important point here is that are we doing a good enough job to make sure that our data is accurate? Which means a bit more of an involved process around data quality and data auditing to make sure that our data is accurate and reflects the true state of an employee at any given point in time. Okay? So these are some of the things I think that we're talking about with respect to Article 5. I think about this article with respect to data quality and data auditing, which we have a tool for, which I'll explain in just a moment here. Again, wholeheartedly recommend reading this specific article around data quality when you're dealing with your SuccessFactors and SAP HCM environments. Okay, so that in mind, or some of those things in mind, how do we deal with them effectively? Well, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to identify what data that what let's say areas of GDPR I'm in compliance with or not in compliance with. And so we answer this question with a tool called Audit and Compliance. And again, we have both a SuccessFactors flavor of this, a SAP HCM, or some sort of hybrid flavor if we need to go there, to be able to identify the information that is in compliance or not in compliance. And the way that I like to, let's say, use an analogy for what audit compliance will do for you is I like to make the analogy of an airplane. So let's say I'm in an airplane and I'm the pilot and I'm flying the airplane. I have a cockpit in front of me. Okay, and when I'm flying that airplane, I can't afford to run reports on a regular basis to try to find out the mission critical data that I need to be able to understand whether my system is working properly. So in this case, I'm not going to run hundreds of reports to try to understand whether I'm GDPR compliant. I want to basically have a series of alerts that pop up that show me whether I'm in compliance, and if I'm not in compliance, tell me where I need to address the information so that I become in compliance. Okay, so a pilot in an airplane is not running a report that says, show me how much gas I have, show me how much distance I have to my target, do some math or VLOOKUPs to understand whether or not I have, let's say, the two rationalized properly. I have let's say, an instrument in my dashboard where I can rely on the fact that if I don't have enough gas to get to my destination, a red light will start to blink, or an alarm will go off, or both, which alerts my attention and says, make sure that you look at this right now because it needs your attention. And so we take the same approach with audit and compliance to HR data to try to determine whether or not we have those issues, and then when we do, to alert your HR business users to the fact that there's something out of compliance. Okay, so again, in our examples, maybe it's, which we'll see, maybe it's we have terminated employees that we're storing passport data for that have been terminated for more than 2 years, so we need to get rid of this information. That type of idea. So I will pause there briefly, and I'll jump back into the system and show you a little bit of audit compliance for a couple minutes, so you get the idea of how this will help with making sure that we process data accordingly. Okay, and just make sure that my screen is still sharing appropriately. I think that I'm still screen sharing here, and somebody will tell me otherwise. Is my screen still sharing appropriately? Or are we stuck on a slide?
Yes, we can still see your screen. And just a reminder, if anyone has any questions at any time, to submit them.
Okay. And Maureen, just to make sure, you're seeing a SuccessFactors screen right now. Is that correct? Okay, perfect. Wasn't updating for me. Great. So again, I am in SuccessFactors now, another extension that we'll click on here within my SuccessFactors environment for audit and compliance specifically. Okay. And the first thing I'll do is choose basically a bucket of rules that I want to be able to look at. So remember I talked about this whole idea of making sure that we have a cockpit which is designed with our specific instruments. So in this case, we have rules that we're going to specify that are business specific. So your rules may be things like making sure that we have employees who are hourly who have an hourly pay component, or salary have a salary pay component, or maybe it's that everybody at your company has an email address at yourcompany.com, or maybe it's that terminated employees for more than 2 years don't have any specific personal identifiable data left in the system. These are all rules that you can set up and turn on that are company specific for audit and compliance, which you can then look at. So if I want to choose, let's say, which rules I'm going to look at here, and then choose from a list of rules, we can see a bunch of different rules here around missing bank accounts and FTEs with incorrect weekly working hours and incorrect email formats. But the ones I'm interested in specifically are around terminated employees and whether or not we still have identifiable information for those employees. So I'll choose a couple of those rules, and then I'll look at them in the workbench. Okay? And so you can see here that we have 2 rules that popped up. Now what we're seeing on the left-hand side of my screen when it loads ultimately, and I think there's a bit of delay here, so I'll pause for a second, but ultimately when we load on the left-hand side, we will see a couple of rules that show me which employees in my system actually triggered these issues. Right? So again, I don't have to run a million reports to say, show me a report that gives me just the terminated employees who have a work permit, or show me the employees who have dependents in the system still after they're terminated. I can see all my information in one place, and then I can see some information around who triggered those rules and some specifics from SuccessFactors for those rules. So if we look here on the left-hand side of my screen, I see a rule that shows me, and my resolution isn't great, so my apologies, but a rule that shows me, let's say, terminated employees with an active work permit. Okay, so these are employees in this rule specifically who have been terminated for more than 2 years and still have a work permit information in the system. And you can see that there were 4 employees that were triggered, and then 4 employees still that were outstanding. And we have the ability to set, severities for these, whether it's high severity or low severity, which would bump them into different categories for me and allow me to filter associatively. So, for example, if I wanted to look at just, rules with a severity of 8 or 7 or 6 and higher, I could do that and start to do some filtering. So that's important. In this case, I'm looking at my GDPR specific rules, and we could do a bucket of rules around GDPR specifically, and we can see now which employees have triggered those rules. So I have 4 employees that triggered the rules here: Janet Cook, Andres Duke, and Goska and Alexander Nietzsche. And then if we wanted to, we could see, let's say, some more information around these employees pulled directly from SuccessFactors. So I don't have to jump around to a bunch of different systems in this case. I could see all my information here, although it's configurable to see what's there or not. So in this case, I can see some information, some personal information. Maybe I can see some employee details and dates, or org information for this person, job information, or some of the other things I want to be able to look at, national ID. And then I also have the ability to actually jump into SuccessFactors in this case and look to see what's still stored for this employee. So you can see it's an inactive employee. You can see that if you want to look at their specific information, I think this is a rule around work permit. So we could go down and look and see what work permit information was there for this specific employee, and then as needed, purge appropriately. Or if we were using Clone and Test Cloud, let's say scramble the information appropriately so that wasn't real work permit data for that person. So I would take my appropriate associated action. I would jump back into SuccessFactors, and I would hit this button that says recheck, which would then go and check the system to make sure that the information was actually resolved appropriately and no longer violated my rules. And again, I think there's a bit of a delay here, so my apologies. But hopefully we'll catch up shortly so that you can be on the same page as me. Maybe what we'll do here briefly, Maureen, is take a quick break and answer a couple of questions here to make sure that we're addressing some of the feedback that's coming from the audience. I know there's a lot of people out there with questions. So before we jump into the next topic or go a little bit further on audit compliance, we'll ask a couple of quick questions. So let's do that now, Maureen. If you could give me a couple of questions here, we'll answer them briefly.
Sure. We have a question from Andy. Is Clone and AMP test just for SuccessFactors, or do you have the same tool for SAP?
Yeah, good question. So everything I'm showing you today, I guess we're demonstrating it in SuccessFactors. It's a bit of let's say it's a bit of a newer technology. They run on the SAP Cloud Platform, the tools that I'm showing you here. But we have flavors of this for both SAP HCM and SuccessFactors and hybrids for everything you're seeing here today. So it's not that we'll work with just SuccessFactors or just HCM. It will work with either or both, and happy to go into more detail with whoever asked that question at a later date to show them the specifics and how this tool might look in ECC as opposed to in SuccessFactors. Next question.
Great. We have a question from Mark. Can we do more than one employee at a time?
With Clone and Test, I assume the question is for, and the answer is absolutely yes. You could run the entire organization in one go, or just subsets of the organization if you'd like. So I showed you a demonstration of just one employee just for expediency's sake, but rest assured you can do it for the entire organization in one go. So for example, when you move from your prod environment to your QA environment, you could do the entire organization in one run as part of your regular processing. Next question.
And we have another question from Mark. Are they standard out-of-the-box rules, or did you create them for the company?
Right. For audit and compliance, good question. So we have what we call a catalog of about 1,000 rules that we consider to be best practice rules from an auditing perspective that have been kind of gleaned from other customers and kind of built up over the course of a decade's worth of experience in the auditing area that we come to the table with. So you can look at that catalog, let's say pick and choose what makes sense, but then at the same time you have the ability to add to it if something that you want to be able to add that's not on the catalog is there. So I would say you have it both ways. You have the predefined Accenture software rules for the software tool that gives you a leg up, but then you can also add your own rules into place if you don't see what you need there. Hopefully that answers that question. Another question.
From Julie, does my version of SAP HCM matter?
Yeah, good question, Julie. So I would say in general, so yes, absolutely matters, but with both Clone and Test and Audit and Compliance, the two tools that you've seen thus far, we support versions of SAP going back quite far. If you can believe it, Clone and Test was around in some fashion or another in R3. So yes, it matters, but I would say that we support very, very early versions of SAP ECC. So let's discuss the specific enhancement pack that you're running, and then we can decide whether or not it makes sense. Okay, let's do one more question, and then we'll jump into a little bit more on audit compliance, and then finally one more on the document lifecycle before we go straight to questions for the rest of the session.
Great.
One more question.
Final question from Kevin. Are these Accenture apps self-service, or are we dependent on Accenture consulting?
Yeah, good question. So I would say in general, these are totally self-service apps that customers can deploy and run on their own. Certainly in the on-premise space, that's absolutely the case. When it comes to SuccessFactors cloud-based environments, we do offer an option whereby Accenture, let's say, does the hosting and some of the, let's say, technical work behind the scenes. If you'd like to go that way, but certainly not the case. So you can deploy this yourself. You can run this yourself. You're certainly not dependent on Accenture going forward. And I should also mention that, again, I work for Accenture Software for HCM, which is, let's say, a small niche area within the larger Accenture organization. And working or, let's say, procuring these software tools certainly does not mean that you need to work with Accenture as a whole. We work with many different SIs for many different customers to either put these into place or to run them on an ongoing basis if customers want to be able to do that, or if they want to do it themselves. So again, you have lots of different SIs that you're working with. We're happy to work with them. We do on a regular basis. So it's certainly not a problem. And you can certainly deploy these applications yourself, maintain them yourself on an ongoing basis, and where you'd like the assistance from Accenture, utilize our assistance if you need to. Yeah? Okay, so with that, I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so with our one remaining topic, and then we'll jump into whatever remaining questions are to be able to address any other outstanding questions that there are. I know there's a lot more that we want to get to, so hold those thoughts. Now, just to finish off audit and compliance very, very briefly, but so we're seeing a little slice of this, but rest assured that, let's say there's a lot more behind the scenes than what you're just seeing here. So we have the ability to do a lot of reporting out of this tool. I'm just going to kind of take you behind the scenes for a second with some technical stuff, but you're seeing we have a lot of reporting out of this tool, so you can pull reports that show you, let's say, high-level information around what was triggered, when it was triggered, who triggered it, some information from SuccessFactors at the same time around the employees if you want to be able to do that. Our newest, we have some very new features coming out around analysis or analytics to show you some pretty graphs and charts and things that allow us to see, at a high level what our trending is like, whether we're seeing more issues or less issues, and where those issues are based off of geographies. So if you're a multinational corporation, how your geographies stack up with respect to data compliance. We have an awful lot around authorizations and who can see what and when they pull. But in general, we do utilize SuccessFactors authorizations to be able to see who's allowed to access the data, when they can access it, and how they can access it. So we mimic those permissions as well. And you don't have to do it or program those permissions in two different places. So very kind of mature. This is a very mature tool for SuccessFactors. It's been around for, I want to say, 6 or 7 years now, which is about as mature as SuccessFactors extensions could possibly be. We have this at very large customers, 300,000 plus employees who are using this in 50 plus countries. Great fit from a compliance perspective to make sure that we stay in compliance from a GDPR perspective, that we catch all of the different things we want to be able to catch, that we catch them in one place and we don't miss information. Okay, so that was a little bit about audit compliance and how it can help us deal with personal data processing within GDPR specifically. Okay, the last topic I want to touch on very briefly is, we'll keep going here. I missed one slide, but we'll keep going very briefly. The last topic I want to talk about briefly is this whole idea of what is collected for an individual employee, when it's used, how it's erased, when it's erased, and the idea of data portability. Okay, so when we look at some of the articles around 1314, 1725, and you can see some blurbs around, maybe it can help you with, delve into this at a later date with the specific areas, but you can see some blurbs around this. But, we're asking ourselves some questions around, first of all, knowing that an employee has the right to view the data that we've collected about them, do we have all of that data that we've collected about them ready to be able to be presented to the employee when they ask? So can we appropriately provide the employee with the data that has been collected for that person? Okay? Do we have the right consent documented for the data that we've obtained? So, making sure that we have the information consented for what we have in the system. And then ultimately, when an employee is terminated or when they leave or when they go somewhere else, do we have the ability to delete that data appropriately? Have we deleted it? And is there any outstanding information for those employees? So these are all things that GDPR addresses and that we have to think about when we're dealing with our systems going forward in May. And one of the ones that I want to focus on specifically is around data portability and identifying the data that has been collected for the employee. And so I think it's not enough anymore to just be able to have, let's say, I know I've worked with a lot of customers who have this, what they call an audit report or a big employee data audit, where they're basically pulling every single field from either SuccessFactors or SAP that shows them information around an employee that we can see what data has been collected for them. Now we have to have some way of being able to transmit that data appropriately in a nice format or function to the employee themselves so that they can see what we store in the system for them at any given point in time. And the way we answer that specifically with Accenture software is a software tool that we call Doc Composer, or it's the SAP flavor Quick Document Builder, but the same kind of idea. And this is a tool that lets us very quickly and easily create nice looking documents, whether it's ad hoc or as part of a process or a workflow for employees that spit out all the information in the system that we want to be able to pull for that specific employee. Okay, so I'll go into the system briefly and show you this. And hopefully I'm still logged in here. You can see here that I have a widget for Document Composer. And it's being pulled up right now. Okay. So what are you seeing with Document Composer specifically? So you are now seeing, let's say, well, I'll show you. If we do what we call a quick tour here, and it's going to be a bit of a delay here, but we have the ability to create basically a template for a document, okay? And this allows us to fill this template with information about an employee. So in our case, we're looking at data portability, being able to show the employee the data that we collect for them in the system. So we'll create a new template around that. We have the ability to search for a specific template, employee, or keyword relating to employee correspondence in this case. We have the ability to organize these templates into some sort of folder so that we can access them or create a logical grouping of some sorts. And we have the ability to edit these templates, duplicate them, delete them, version them, et cetera, so that we can work with them appropriately in the context of a large organization. Okay? So all important things with respect to employee correspondence, which we're dealing with when we talk about employee portability. So in this case, I've done a search for, well, I can delete that and show you again, but I've done a search for a specific employee. So I type in the employee's name here. Aaron Abbott, who has left our company, has requested that we provide them with a list of all of the pieces of personal data that we have in the system for them. And what I've done is I've actually created a document called GDPR Data Portability, which addresses this. It will pull up the individual information around this employee. So when I click on it, you'll see that we actually generate the document immediately, or the correspondence immediately, for this employee right away. Okay, so you can see here I have a nice template that says, Dear Aaron Abbott, here is the information that we collected as of the beginning of your employment, August 1st, 2017. And here's all the different pieces of information that we have. And if this employee wanted to take it with them to another organization, you could very quickly and easily push this document to the person. Now, one of the nice things about Document Composer is every organization is going to be different with respect to what they're storing around their employees with respect to personal data. So we have the ability to very quickly and easily modify this document, okay, so that we can add, remove, delete, do very pretty things, and make it look as pretty as we can. So let's say that I wanted to add in the the email address for the emergency contact. You can see here, changing the template to add that in is very, very quick. All I kind of do is add the field here. I'm going to click on the hashtag button, which allows me to type in a field from SuccessFactors. And when I type in emergency, I get all the information here around emergency contacts. So this is basically all the different pieces of information that we store for emergency contacts within the SuccessFactors. and I can click on the email. And what this does is it inserts in this template the field for email, which will allow me, when I generate this document for a specific employee, to pull that information in from SuccessFactors. One of the real strengths of this tool is how easy it is to edit these templates. Whether it's, like I said, on the fly ad hoc, if you have the appropriate security authorizations to do that, or if we're doing this from a much more rigid, structured workflow perspective, where we want to be able to make sure that we use the same, let's say, terminology for all employees in the organization, we can do that as well. Okay, so you've seen we've added in the email address there. So now I want to save this information. I want to save the template, and now I'm going to go back and search and see what this looks like. Now that the email address is in there, if I scroll down, I can see now we've pulled the emergency email address in. It was as easy as that. Now, this is a bit more of an administrator's view, or let's say a managerial view of this. We can also just provide the PDF directly to the employees so they don't see any of these screens, or we can do things like email, or we can do things like batch email, or we also have the ability to push this to an employee record, an employee folder of some sorts within SuccessFactors. So a lot of different functionality there, and a lot of the different items that you need to make this specific and relevant to a company that needs to be GDPR compliant, which is, let's say, multinational perhaps, where we have a lot of, let's say, ability to do dynamic statements within the document themselves. So if the employee is part of that organization, use that document, or say this blurb, or don't include this information in the document if they're not a manager, et cetera, et cetera. So idea being very quick, easy way of creating employee correspondence, and in this case, let's say some sort of employee portability options so that the employee can take the information, or you can show the employee which information that has been, let's say, retained for that person for the purposes of being used within the SuccessFactors environment. Okay, that was a mouthful. I've given you about, let's say, close to 50 minutes of information here around GDPR and some of the software tools that we provide to help address the problems. So now I think it makes sense to go to questions for the last couple of minutes. So what I'll do is I will put up my contact information here, if I can find it, which you can follow up with me as we start to ask some questions. So with that, let's jump into it. Maureen, can you go to the audience?
Absolutely. We have a question from Pauline. Can Document Composer pull data from multiple systems?
Okay, good question. So I would say out of the box, vanilla Doc Composer has the ability to pull from SuccessFactors. Now we do also have a flavor that allows us to pull from SAP and SuccessFactors at the same time, so you could pull information from both systems into a document. If you wanted to pull information from a separate system altogether, okay, it's technically possible, but it wouldn't be part of the vanilla functionality and would require some additional work to be able to make that happen. We do have customers who have done that and use Doc Composer specifically with other systems. So, for example, we have a healthcare company, a large healthcare company that we're working with that uses Doc Composer to be able to create documents, for the hospital that they run. So certainly possible, but I don't want to give you the idea. Out of the box for Doc Composer for the SuccessFactors version specifically, we support SuccessFactors, and then we have a flavor that sits on the SAP system that you're not seeing right now, but I can certainly show you at a later date, which works with both SAP HCM and SuccessFactors if you'd like to go that direction. Next question.
Great. We have another question from Mark. Does the audit feature work across SF modules?
Yes. So basically what we're so from a bit of a technical background, what we do to read the data, whether it's for Clone or Audit or Doc Composer, is we utilize what SAP provides, SAP SuccessFactors provides, to be able to read data. Okay? Now, wherever that's the case, we have the ability to look at data in the SuccessFactors system. So in practice, this means pretty much anything from Employee Central. We have the ability to look at a lot of the talent modules like performance and succession or recruiting. But there are some, let's say, gaps within the APIs or what SuccessFactors allows you to read through OData, specifically around learning, if I might say, which would prevent us from being able to audit data. Okay, so happy to discuss the specific use cases that you're looking for. So in general, we look at Employee Central, Employee Profile, because I think that's where we have the most use cases, but not prevented from doing this in other areas of SuccessFactors at the same time. And also worthwhile mentioning, again, we do have the ability to look across systems at both SuccessFactors and SAP HCM to see if data lines up from a replications perspective, or to look at payroll data in SAP. So very worthwhile looking at specifically if you have ECP installed, or if you're running on-premise payroll, or if you're having issues with your replication, to be able to set up rules that say, let me know when something doesn't match up, for example. So happy to talk about that much more in detail at the same time. Next question.
Next question from Jin. Can I subscribe to one of the apps, or do I need to purchase all of the Accenture apps?
Yeah, good question. So no, you can certainly subscribe to just one app. And worthwhile mentioning that from a subscription model these days, we try to mimic what SuccessFactors is doing. So in general, it's a per employee, per cost to the applications, and again, to the individual applications. So you don't need to subscribe to all. You can subscribe to one. So that means if you're a small organization, it'll be a different price than a larger organization, obviously. And we like to be as flexible as we can to make sure that we are fulfilling the business case to make it worthwhile to acquire these software tools and to work with you to make sure that that's the case. Next question.
Next question from Terry. Do customers get pre-configured or best practice setting in these apps?
Yep, absolutely. So I mentioned audit compliance. We come to the table with about 1,000 different rules, or a catalog of rules that kind of contain best practices from other companies we've worked with from a data quality and auditing perspective. So that's really where that question applies most to. I think with respect to clone and audit, we provide more than enough flexibility to be able to, let's say, execute business functions in a generic way. But worthwhile mentioning, just off the top of my head also, there's a module or a piece of functionality for clone and test, which I didn't mention, called HR Data Loader, which is really a mass load tool into SuccessFactors, allows us to carry out mass processing like mass terminations or mass hires or mass pay changes. And for HR Data Loader, we do offer standardized processes that you can utilize to do those mass transactions, although you can certainly customize them or create new processes if you want that allow you to load SuccessFactors up with information into your source system of record. So absolutely, we do come to the table with best practices. Next question
from Wendy. Is there a recommendation for Document Composer for benefits functionality and data?
I'm not completely certain I understand the question. So maybe it makes sense to just ask whoever asked the question to follow up with me over email, and we can address the question. Let's do that. Yep. Let's move to the next question.
Sure. The next question is from Sanjay. How does the Instant Sync tool compare to the Clone and Test Cloud app?
Great question. So Instant Sync in general is a tool from SAP that is meant to copy configuration data from one system to another. So the good way to describe this is if you think about the transport process within SAP HCM, Instant Sync is meant to mimic the transport process within SAP HCM very clearly. With Clone and Test, we're not dealing with any configuration at all, unless we're talking about some, let's say, foundation objects, which you could consider, or MDF objects, which you might consider config data a little bit. But in general, we are dealing with employee master data. So Instant Sync deals with the config data, and Clone and Test deals with employee master data. So that's the very clear division. Between the two pieces of functionality. To my knowledge, I'm certain SAP SuccessFactors does not have any functionality on the SuccessFactors side that would allow you to copy pieces of master data from one system to another, or to be able to scramble the data in any environments. And I'm actually not familiar with any tools today that will allow you to do that, other than Clone and Test for Cloud. Next question.
This is from Priya. How long does it take to install the Accenture apps?
Yeah, good question. So the extensions in the cloud in general are very quick and easy to install, again, generally speaking. it's let's say a similar process to what you would do from an extension in SAP HCM, but we're pushing it to the cloud. So typically speaking, just installing the tool is a couple of hours worth of work, and then configuring the tool can be variable depending on what the requirements are. So typically speaking, I would say we take somewhere between a week and 2 weeks to actually configure audit compliance, or clone and test, or doc composer for that matter, before we talk about the regular business processes that you'd have around testing and QA and all of those different processes that you have, which could drag things out before you get to production. But most of the time, we're talking about a couple of hours worth of work to install in a system, and then somewhere in the neighborhood of a week to a couple of weeks from configuration perspective before we get to production. Okay, one more thing I want to show before we go to the next question. I'm going to scroll up here briefly. Okay, we have a bunch of road shows coming up in Toronto, Philadelphia, Atlanta, San Francisco, and Chicago, where we are going to be presenting some of this stuff and diving into detail with SuccessFactors and Workforce Software. And so we're very much looking forward to those. If you guys are anywhere near the areas, we'd love to see you out there. There's a registration link within the presentation that you can request afterwards. So highly recommend you guys register for those, and we'd love to see you there specifically. So please do so, and we can deal with any more questions individually at those sessions or from a follow-up via email. So I think that's all the time we have now. I'm going to pass it back to you, Maureen. I thank everybody very, very much for joining us for the hour to talk about GDPR and the software tools that we have to help address some of the new challenges that GDPR presents, and looking forward to following up and talking with you folks in the near future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ari and Tobias, for a great webcast. On behalf of ASUG, I'd like to thank Accenture as well as all of you who took the time out to attend this webcast today. Before we go, I'd like to leave our audience members with some quick information on ASUG for anyone unfamiliar with our organization. ASUG helps connect SAP customers to the people and information that provide the insight, influence, and inspiration they need to maximize the return on their investment in SAP and drive innovation at their organizations. We offer 38 chapters, 90 special interest groups, and access to digital content like this webinar. If you'd like more information, please message info@asug.com. The recording and slides from today's program will be posted to the ASUG website, and all registrants will receive an email with the link to those materials. Please take a moment to complete the survey by clicking on the green button at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'd like to close today's webcast. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.